Emily is a professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She's an ecologist whose studies focus on conservation biology, invasion ecology, and ecosystem resilience. She's perfect for this seminar series, which focuses on cross-continental European and African studies and water security, as she completed her PhD at Rhodes University in South Africa, which examined methods to control invasive aquatic plant species in freshwater systems, which I'm looking forward to hearing more about. Since then, she's been a lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University and Liverpool John Moores University, both in the UK, where she's continued her work on investigating invasive plant species in areas including the Ngorongoro Conservation Area in Tanzania. Recently, she's been based at Leiden University, where she co-leads a research group called the WildCoLab, which focuses on human and wildlife peaceful coexistence, particularly in Eastern and Southern Africa. So it's with great pleasure that I hand over to Emily for her presentation on alien plants, passengers and drivers of change in aquatic systems.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. What a lovely introduction. Yeah, super nice. And hi, everyone. 22 people. Really nice to see you all. Well, sort of see little circles with your initials in. That'll do. And yeah, hello from a kind of very cold and dark Netherlands today. And thank you for having me. So yeah, my name is Emily, and I think Sarah gave a really nice introduction there. So yeah, I'm primarily interested in alien invasive species, but in the context of people, really, and work a lot in obviously in academia, but try and work as much as possible with institutions outside as well. So a lot with government organizations, NGOs, local communities. I've been really lucky in that my work has taken me in many different parts of the world, and really the majority of my work is now East and Southern Africa, which we'll talk quite a lot about. And yeah, I'm passionate about lots of things, but also about amplifying voices in STEM you don't tend to hear so much. And that comes out in various different ways in different projects. And maybe we have time to talk a bit about that too, but we'll see. And yeah, this is the lab I co-lead here at Leiden, WildCoLab Leiden. It's WildCoLab because it's all about human-wildlife coexistence. And we're really interested in using fundamental ecology and fundamental science for applied results. So researching real solutions towards sustainable human-wildlife coexistence. And we sort of have two main research pillars. One is to do with healthy landscapes. So that's really invasive plants, both aquatic and terrestrial. And the other is to do with human-wildlife conflict. I bring the sort of planty knowledge, and I co-lead with my colleague Michiel Veldhuis, and his background is more with big mammals, big animals. And yeah, my email address is up here. It also appears in a few more slides as well. And I can't see any of you. So if you do have any questions or anything like that during the talk, please feel free. Just turn your mic on and start talking. Maybe that's a good way of doing it, because I can't see if you raise a hand very politely, I'm afraid. And yeah, as Sarah said, I'm a professor here at Leiden University, and I also hold an honorary research position at Rhodes University in Makanda in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, because I still collaborate a lot there, supervise some PhDs, etc. So invasive species, that's really where my ecological heart lies. You probably, hopefully, maybe familiar with this depressing graphic. And this is from a really nice paper a few years ago about bending the curve of biodiversity loss. And it sort of zooms out and looks, we're on this decline, right, of global biodiversity. And we're at a point now where we've got some big decisions to make about how we're going to protect biodiversity, manage what we do have, and going forward, sort of, especially in a warming world. And invasive species are often cited as the second largest threat to that biodiversity loss. And these come with huge costs, like huge economic costs as well. There's lots of numbers floating around there. They're all big, is all you really need to know. But I think, yeah, an example that just looking at insects alone, only in terms of their impacts on agriculture and forestry, it's estimated about $70 billion a year globally. So this is a big, big problem. I think I really like it as a field of study because of the unknown effects. There's so much we don't know. These are new species in new areas. Sometimes these species create their own habitats when they're in there. So it's really a super interesting field from a sort of fundamental ecologist point of view. And then the other side of it, the reason I really love invasion ecology is because it is obviously it's a science, but it's completely wrapped up in people's opinions and values and ideas of risk or safety. You can grab someone off the street and maybe ask them about invasive species, and they'll tell you about something they maybe have seen on the news or the media, and they'll have very strong opinions about what should or shouldn't be done. And even though that's nothing to do with maybe their background or their education, what have you. And I really like that. I like that it stokes people's sort of juices get flowing and people can get quite confrontational, I suppose, about it. But I think it's a really interesting field because of that. And it's only going to become more common. So we are living in the Anthropocene. We're defining our environment more than ever. And with climate change, with globalization, with more movement of people, we see more movement of species. And I'm sure for many of you, the definitions are all super clear, but there are a lot of terms that roll around like alien, native, non-native, invasive. And it's just nice if we start the talk today all absolutely confident that we're on the same page. So non-native species move around a lot, huge amounts, and most of the time it's totally fine. So it's really important to have it clear that not all non-native species are bad, and a species that has sort of spread beyond its natural distribution boundaries, that is a non-native species. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's invasive. So many non-native species might get introduced to a new environment, might establish and become an established alien species, as we say, in that they are able to reproduce successfully with successful offspring, and they might just become part of the landscape there. And then you can get into all sorts of nice long discussions with especially anthropologists and sociologists about what time are we calling things native, not native. That's fine. But today we're really talking about invasive alien species. So when a species is termed invasive, and especially alien invasive, which is what we're talking about today, those have to have adverse effects. And those effects can be on the ecosystems, they could be economic effects. Maybe they outcompete native species for different resources. Maybe they directly predate native species. We see lots of issues with hybridization now that we're getting much better at picking up genetic patterns. It could be they just directly damage the habitats they're in. It could be disease transmission. Either they carry disease themselves, or they carry hitchhikers, or they act as reservoirs for disease. So they're just pools of disease for us, and many others too. I'm not going to give you a whole history of sort of invasion ecology, but I think it is nice to understand that these problems can all be looked at from a sort of more social science lens or socioeconomic lens, as well as the environmental lens. And I really try and walk in the middle there and work with people a lot on both sides, because I think that's a really important issue. And it is growing, and it's growing not only in real terms, but also in terms of people's knowledge and understanding. It's becoming a lot more mainstream, I think, compared to maybe 10 years ago when I told people what I did, compared to now. It's in like local news, national news. I've worked a lot in South Africa and in Europe, and it's really interesting there, the difference you get teaching to younger students, because you really see which countries have a culture of talking about these things, have had issues with these. It really does reflect, but it is, it's catching up everywhere now. There's a graph on the right there. That's from a really nice paper that was looking at global economic costs of specifically aquatic invasive species. It's a really nice paper. I didn't put the reference. That's terrible. Cuthbert et al. Really nice. And if you're interested in these sorts of things, I would go and look it up. It's big review. One particular group of invasive aquatic species are floating invasive macrophytes. So these are just plants, so macrophytes, aquatic plants that are free floating. So they have roots, but those roots are not affixed to any substrate. So they're not rooted at the bottom. We call those submerged plants, like at the bottom of a lake or a river. They're not rooted at the side, where we'd call emergent plants. These are really free floating on the water's surface. I'm not sure who we've got in the audience today, but here are some sort of classics. I would say, as an invasion ecologist, especially if you're talking about Southern Africa, you might know these are sort of the alternative big five. And actually, I often show this slide to my students here in Europe, and I say, okay, do you recognize any of these plants? And they all say, no. You say, okay, well, the one on the left, the far left there, you cycle past that every single day because it surrounds it's in all the sort of ditches and canals we have here in the Netherlands in the Bioscience Park. And they go, no, never seen it before. So it's amazing how much people don't notice plants, but it's very much here and yeah, really covers a lot of our water systems. And all of these are problematic in many parts of the world. I've lumped them all together because we can talk about them separately and we'll look at some examples, but they have very shared traits. So just as an example, this is a picture of a lake covered in pistia. So this is water lettuce. And this plant comes from South America, and it creates these incredible, and these all do, so all these plants, the water hyacinth, parrot's feather, azolla, salvinia, pistia, they all do similar things in that they create these dense floating mats on top, really like a carpet on top of the water. And obviously, no sunlight is able to get through here to penetrate into the water column. That means the submerged plants that grow underneath aren't able to photosynthesize, so they can't provide oxygen to the water. And then we see huge declines in biodiversity. This has massive implications for livelihoods. I mean, if you imagine this water body is either where you get just potable water, perhaps it's where your job is tied to, perhaps your fishing community, whatever it might be. So just access, health, livelihoods, even for people who are not directly using the water, livestock drown a lot because they can't really tell the difference between this and a field, which I think is fair enough. It's completely covered. And the sort of ecological traits all these plants have is that they grow super fast. It is incredible how quickly these can grow. And this picture you're seeing here, that entire mat will have come from one individual plant. They're able to reproduce clonally, vegetatively, and they have the mother plant in the middle, and they spread out these ramets with little daughter plants. Then those break off and they do the same again. And if you have the right conditions, this can be a really, really quick transformation of your ecosystem. They have these massive root systems. I mean, I'm not very tall, but some of these root systems can maybe be taller than I am. And the leaves on the top, they're also huge. So they're just excellent competitors for able to suck up all those nutrients in the water and get all that sunlight from the top as well. So they're just like uber competitors in these systems. And something that many native plants are not is they're highly pollutant tolerant, especially pistia, actually. It does really well in systems that many plants would find toxic, like too much ammonia, for example. These plants love it. And just quickly to show you the sort of spread we're talking about. So this is pistia. These are just some maps I took off GBIF. If you look at the 90s, we do see a spread. If you look at 2010, 2025, you can really see, if I flick back, you see a big spread in terms of where these plants are. And that's also an underestimation as well, because many of these plants, many of these records, we have lots of biases in where we record this data from. So I work on systems in sub-Saharan Africa, but also here in Europe. This is where I live and where I have projects also. And it's amazing the similarities there are. And it could be that in terms of the land use pressures, for a long time, especially in Europe, people ignored these plants. They were like, that's not a big deal. It's a big deal in other places. And Africa was really struggling, especially South Africa was really struggling with a lot of these plants choking their systems. And Europe never paid much attention because we always had really cold winters. So a lot of these plants just couldn't survive in our really frosty winters. But it's getting much warmer here now. Our winters are getting much milder. These plants are starting to do much better. Our water quality as well is definitely going downhill in many systems across Europe. So we've got a lot of nice nutrients for these plants, and we've got nice toasty environments. So these plants are doing well. They are spreading. We're seeing now, especially in warmer parts of Europe, Mediterranean and Portugal, places like that are seeing problems that maybe in South Africa they would recognize from a few decades ago as, okay, we recognize what's happening there, which means there's a real opportunity to share knowledge, to learn from each other, to share experiences. And I think that's something that's been underdeveloped and underused over in recent decades. So that's something to change for sure. So one thing that these plants do, or a term we often give them, is call them ecosystem engineers. I mean, look at how much they dominate these systems. So they're really able to disrupt the core structure and functioning of an ecosystem. They can create whole new feedback loops, which make them incredibly stable. They're degraded, they're not in states we want them to be in, but they're very stable. So I'm using terms like feedback loops and stable states. And just to jump into a little bit of theory for those not familiar, we all know that all ecosystems are defined by the interactions and processes within them. And they're dynamic. So we have lots of feedback loops happening between nutrients, between biomass, between individual species, and all of those things sort of added together give you your identity of your system. And those processes in a non-degraded state maintain an equilibrium and make it stable. It's often sort of depicted using a ball and cup diagram. So we see here, so you have these valleys. So if you imagine the ball is your ecosystem, say it's a shallow lake, freshwater lake, and the valley it's in, those are the environmental conditions. And we want that to be a nice deep valley because we say that that is representation of your system having high resilience, meaning you can have some changes to your environment. Your environmental conditions could change in a way, but the integrity and the sort of core identity, so the key species, the key interactions, the nutrient cycling remain as they are, and you can keep your system as it is. However, what we now know is that if we have a change in underlying variables, it can make our system have very low resilience, meaning it doesn't take much. It could just be a very, very small final disturbance to the system, and very quickly it shifts from one state into another, and normally into a degraded one. I'll try and make it a bit less abstract here. So here we have the ball and cup diagram. This is our ball is our community here. And a change in one or more dominant species, perhaps, such as an invasive species, could force the ball into this new stable state. And what we are now discovering, and what I'm going to talk a bit about today, is trying to get that ball back. So if you imagine we have if I go here, so yeah, your first state is one of high native biodiversity, clear water, fish species, plant species, whatever it might be. And over time, those environmental conditions change, perhaps in the form of pollution or too many nutrients in the system. And if we have invasive species who can take the benefits of those extra nutrients in the system, they can quickly dominate and become very stable. And what's interesting is that not always do we find that restoring the system to what it was before is enough to actually restore our ecosystem. So here we want to restore it to the state where it isn't degraded by invasive species. And we want it to be resilient. So it can take a bit of change because we know we're living in a climate change era. We know that pressures are on. So if we look at the system on face value, the obvious answer is, well, let's remove the invasive species. That's the threat. We've got this, you saw that picture of the lake covered with these plants. We need to remove them. And that makes complete sense. And South Africa has a really long history with these floating aquatic plants. Some more pictures here. I think they speak more words than I would need to say. I mean, just look at that absolute domination. That top one, that's water hyacinth, often cited as being the world's worst invasive aquatic species and one of the worst invasive species full stop in the world because of the damage it causes. On the right, we have Pistia there. That's at one of the Kruger sites. And South Africa's got some interesting other variables to it. So firstly, it's just naturally not got that much fresh water. It's just topographically, it's a relatively, doesn't have huge, large bodies of fresh water. If you think like Great Lakes in North America or whatever. That just isn't in the landscape. And this means there's what we call a low evolutionary history of native freshwater species. So the number of native freshwater species that have evolved in these systems is relatively lower than in a place that had lots and lots of large bodies of freshwater for a very long time. That makes sense. And this is also coupled with high nutrient input, predominantly from wastewater management or mismanagement and fertilizer runoff. So agricultural land use pressures, using a lot of fertilizer and that being leached into the water bodies. And there was many things to do with drought as well, with climate change making this worse, having to provide water to a growing population, all these extra pressures being put on the system. So South Africa was really in a situation where these plants were getting so bad and taking away so much of the water, increasing flood risk, which is wasting more precious water. So they really had to decide to ignore, eradicate, or control. And normally when I ask my students this, which do you think, they will almost always say, eradicate. These plants are terrible. These invasive species we've got to eradicate. But actually what we tend to go for is control. And the main reason is that control is more achievable than eradication. And also we want to try and get money for these projects. And if we promise that we can control something rather than get rid of it 100%, that is also useful. So there's different ways to control these plants. There's mechanical. So this is a river in Cape Town, a river system in Cape Town. And here we see a big private expensive digger has been hired, really expensive, to come to these systems to scoop out some of these invasive plants. Major problem with that is that, well, it's not target specific. Obviously, you can't just scoop out the plants you want. You kind of have to remove everything that's green there. And these plants can reproduce clonally, if you remember from the beginning. And you only need a tiny, tiny, tiny fragment of some of these plants for them to still be in the system. So you could remove 99.9% of these plants using this digger, but next summer you come back and that little fragment you left behind has boomed and it looks just the same as it did before. So it's really not cost effective and not targeted either. The other option is chemical control. And again, there are some good chemical programs out there, but overall, chemicals again are often the non-target with plants. So you can't just kill the water hyacinth and not the other plants. Doesn't really work like that. And also a lot of these systems are often systems we want for drinking water. So ideally, we don't want to keep pumping them filled with more chemicals. So the third option was biological control. So this is the release of natural enemies from an invasive species native range to control in its new invaded area. And I'm super excited to be talking about this today because we've got European audiences and African audiences. And I've talked about biocontrol all around the world. And depending on which country I'm in or which continent, you get hugely different responses to this, which I find really interesting. So we haven't got time today to make this too interactive, unfortunately, but I would be curious to know what you guys think about it. But yeah, so this is what sort of South Africa became real world leaders and pioneers in biological control. The first ever biological control program in the world, and not just aquatic, this was actually on a terrestrial species, in the world was in 1913 in South Africa. So South Africa really were the pioneers of this amazing innovation. So just in case you're not familiar, and in case what I've just said to you sounds insane, which is what a lot of European people tell me. So we know about 500,000 herbivorous insects have been described. 70% of those, so the vast majority, are specialists, not generalists. So they're specialists. They have co-evolved so tightly with a host plant, and plant-insect interactions are really, really cool. They're super interesting, and they've sort of gotten to a stage where they're down an almost like an evolutionary dead end. They are so tightly co-evolved. And so what we do is we go to the country where these plants are from. All those ones I showed you earlier on, they're all from South America. So we go to the parts of South America where those plants are from, and we find out, okay, who's who's feeding on you, who's eating you. And we'll find maybe a suite of different insects. Maybe some of them feed only on the seeds, some on the leaves, some on the stems. We'll take those into a quarantine facility and we'll do what's called host spec testing. And that's where we test if this insect even looks at another plant. So we will give it not only the species we're interested in attacking, obviously, but maybe a test list of 200-300 native plant species. These are species that look a bit like the target plant, that are genetically related, that are commercially important, that have nothing to do and are evolutionary, like phylogenetically very far away from the target plant, but maybe they're important in that area for cultural reasons, for crops, for medicinal reasons, whatever it might be. And we test to see what this insect does on those plants. And what we find in many, many situations is that this insect, if you take it off and put it on to another plant, and the option for that insect is to either eat or lay eggs on this other plant or die, it will just die. They're that tightly co-evolved with their partnered plant. So we test them in quarantine, and if they're proven to be really host specific, which we often find they are, and proven to be safe, then those agents are released. And so far, more than 550 agents have been released in 130 countries around the world. Less than 1% of those have had any negative impact on non-target plants. So that means less than 1% were found to munching a little bit. Not that they wiped out a native plant, not that they caused severe damage, but that there was found to be some feeding damage. And all the non-target impacts, so all of those less than 1% incidences, were predictable using the modern weed biocontrol techniques. So some of the agents were released maybe 20 years ago when we had different protocols, et cetera, et cetera. So just to give you an idea of how safe biocontrol is. And it's all about reuniting plants with their specialist predator. And what we see once we do this, it's really nice because insects love to have a lot of babies. So we'll release these insects and they do a very good job of building up their populations, of feeding on their favorite food is everywhere. They can have loads and loads of babies. Those can do a really good job at crashing the plant population. As the plant population begins to shrink, that means the insect population also shrinks. And as the insect population shrinks, the plants can start to recover a bit. And then you fall into this classic predator-prey dynamics you might remember from high school. I think in our textbooks, it was always the snowshoe hare and the lynx, these predator-prey curves. And it's just the same. And it's really just reuniting that plant-predator dynamics. So South Africa really identified that this was really low cost because insects, like I say, like to have babies. They're small. You can grow them on, this is a picture of a research facility in Makanda, in paddling pools, growing their insects on the plants there. It's incredibly low risk. This evolutionary connection they have means that it's super safe. It's really low maintenance, which is nice once you've released the insects. You don't have to keep going back. You want to do a lot of monitoring, obviously, because you want to make sure it's done the best way possible. But it's not like hiring the expensive machinery diggers every season that you had to do. It's created a lot of job opportunities for marginalized communities in South Africa, which has been a really fantastic initiative. You can release multiple agents on one site, and with the chemicals, you can't do that so much. And it's been picked up and is widely used in the States, South America, Australia, New Zealand. Europe they have been reluctant for a really long time. I'm trying my best, but it's coming around slowly. We released one of the first biocontrol agents, got released in the Netherlands this year, actually. So steps are being made, but it's really far behind. And what we really want to see is to make this accessible in Africa. This is an African innovation that has been taken up by the rest of the world and by a lot of countries with a lot more resources. So it would be great to see it taken up by countries there's many programs now happening in Namibia, Zimbabwe. I've got a proposal in, I'm going to sneeze, I apologize. Oh no, maybe not. I've got a cold. We've got a proposal now to release agents in Tanzania later this year as well. And this is what we want to see. We want to see this innovation as something that's accessible to everyone. Just some nice flashy pictures to show you. So this is the Warrington Weir, and this is covered in water hyacinth. And here we have Neocotina bruci, lovely little weevil. There's another one, Neocotina iconoreae, and I don't bother putting a picture up because they're almost identical. Like you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So in one of these particular weevils, you have actually seen them all. And yeah, they just do a fantastic job at eating these plants. And what you want then is these plants are left to these small little reservoirs at the sort of edges of your aquatic system, your lake, your pond, your dam, whatever it is. And you don't want to get rid of those. It's very tempting because you just have a few individual plants left, like, oh, let's just scoop those up or spray them or whatever. But actually you want to keep those little patches of the plants. And that's because they harbor a reservoir of biocontrol agents just waiting there. So if something does happen, so like more nutrients get in the system and these plants do really well, you have particularly warm winter months, whatever it might be, and these plants suddenly do well and explode, the insect populations are right there ready to respond in the way that they naturally would. So that's why it's important to keep them there a little bit. So if this is the silver bullet and if this is just the most fantastic thing ever, which I think it is the most fantastic thing ever, what is the problem and why is anyone still doing any research into this? Well, we know that these invasive aquatic plants are a symptom of a bigger problem. So yes, they do drive huge changes in these systems and lead to the collapse of systems, but they are also passengers of a bigger problem. Eutrophication drives plant invasion. Yes, we need to stop introducing these plants to these systems, but the fact is they do so well in these eutrophic systems. So what's happened now in South Africa, they did this like amazing campaign, put a lot of research, a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of manpower into this. They were able to get on top of many of those floating invasive plants. So many of those species are now listed as being under control in South Africa, thanks in part to biocontrol, in many cases also integrated pest management approach. But it's just a fantastic result. And so everyone expected these systems to be restored and said the relatively few native species would return. This is all good. This is what's going to happen. And that's not exactly what we saw. So what we proposed in this research was a shift between stable states from floating invasive aquatic plants to submerged invasive aquatic plants. In the last 10 years, South Africa's seen a new suite of invasive plants, submerged invasive plants, so rooted along the bottom of the water body, and you only know they're there when they top out at the water surface. And in a way, can be worse than the floating ones, which at least you can see when there's only one or two. And plants like Egeria densa, Brazilian waterweed, but there's many others too. These pictures, these are all, oh no, there's a few, there's Myriophyllum there too. And these plants cause many similar problems in terms of the damage to livelihoods, ecosystem health, native biodiversity. So we did sort of propose this as a regime shift between two stable states. So we had this system dominated by invasive species. We removed those invasive species because that's how we're prone to approach problems in our environment. But the system didn't flip back. The ball didn't tip back into its original state. Instead, it went somewhere unexpected. And this is what we term nonlinear restoration. And by far, nonlinear restoration tends to result in things that are very expensive because it's things we didn't predict. And now we have to manage that. So we had these floating invasive plants. Biological control agents did a fantastic job of chomping away at all this organic matter. There was a big shock of nutrients as all those dead plants sunk into the system. Suddenly, all this light is now in the system as well. So you've got nutrients, you've got light. And what happened was these submerged invasive plants, which were introduced and were around but could never previously do very well because they could never compete with these floating plants for light, etc., suddenly boomed and did really well. That is a picture, that little white dot is me next to a really big pile of Egeria densa that's been scooped out of a river system in Cape Town area. And rightfully so. We're now, South Africa's spending a lot of energy looking into biocontrol agents for these submerged plants, which I fully agree they should be doing because it is a fantastic, sustainable method of control. However, if we are able to remove and get control of all those submerged aquatic plants, what happens next? We didn't predict the first shift. And what's to say what's coming next? Well, we don't know. And generally in environmental management, if there's things we don't know, they tend to be expensive. So prevention is better than the cure. So if this shift is happening, understanding the mechanisms driving it would be really helpful to come up with sort of more efficient control methods. But how do you understand mechanisms of such a system? Well, you need a multifaceted approach. So it needs to incorporate many different elements. So field observations, we need data, as much data as we can from what's happening in the field. We can combine that with modeling, where we can try and alter some of the parameters, see which ones we think have a bigger impact. And we can combine those with quantitative experiments. We really try and tease apart some of the links. So this was what a lot of my PhD work was originally. I'm not going to walk you all through it, but just to give you an overview. So first of all, we tried to identify sites across South Africa which had floating species that were dominant. They used biological control successfully, and when we returned, they were now completely dominated by submerged invasive species. And then we wanted to combine these field observations with quantitative experiments. So I'm talking dustbins here, so nothing fancy, sort of these dustbin experiments where we have the floating invasive on top and we have the submerged invasive underneath. And we'd have different initial planting density, so a competition experiment essentially. And on half of them, we would put the biocontrol agents, and half of them we wouldn't. And we'd repeat this over 4 different nutrient levels to try and understand what are the roles of eutrophication? What are the tipping points? At what point of controlling the floating plants do these submerged plants begin to really take off? And we did the same with, so this was with native submerged plants, and we did the same with invasive submerged plants to try and understand the dynamics that are happening there. Because we want to give these native submerged plants as much of a fighting chance as possible when we know we're going to start to control these floating aquatic plants. So I'm not going to walk into too much detail with these, but these are relative growth rates of the native submerged plants, so grown in all those dustbins, competing with these floating invasives on top at different nutrient levels, with and without biological control agents. So without biocontrol agents on the floating plants on the left-hand column and with on the right. And across the bottom, that's the native submerged plants. And across the top there, that's the invasive, the Brazilian waterweed. And just saw that these native plants, if these floating plants are present, they really don't stand a chance. They have negative growth rates, which that's not a thing. That means they're dying. So these plants are really not doing well. But what was really interesting is with the invasive submerged plants, when they're fighting with these floating plants, that when we put biocontrol on these floating plants, even when you only start with just a very small amount, these plants do really, really well. And we tried to build up this body of evidence for this new regime shift between floating and submerged invasive plants in South Africa. A lot of experiments. That wasn't the only one. There were many, about 10,000 plants I added up over the course of 3 years. And we combined them with modeling. We worked with scientists at Stellenbosch University as well to try and model these dynamics and these interactions. So what's happening with the external nutrients coming in, the nutrients that are created by these massive carpets of floating plants that sink into the system, and how does that relate to the native plant community? And we were able to try to identify tipping points of biocontrol. So at what point of controlling these floating plants do we see a switch from floating to submerged? And the difference in those relationships at low nutrients and high nutrients was really, really shocking. And that was great, because why do all this? Why build all this? What's the practicality of it? Well, it means we're able to show this direct link between these, the way we control these macrophytes, the recovery of the native system in terms of the broader water quality. So we can make clear recommendations that the removal of the invasive species, that can't be the only strategy. It has to happen alongside water quality management. And now there's lots of cool experiments and field experiments happening, looking at what happens if we go in And before we remove these invasive floating plants, we already sort of manipulate these native submerged plants in the system. Can we build up a bit of a defense system there so that when we do control these floating plants, the native community is able to have a fighting chance and respond in the way that we would hope it would do? And yeah, so that was one main project. And I did just want to quickly, I think that one is really, to me, nice because it shows how these plants really engineering their systems, but it's very plant on plant. And especially in the invasive species world for the last 30, 50 years, we're very good at looking things either from a species level or a species on species level. So we might look at what impact it has on a native counterpart, things like that. And we do that a lot. And what we're learning more and more is that we shouldn't do that so much. And actually, we need to understand multi-trophic impacts. And we've got this new project called Mozzimac, which is an international project in Europe and Southern Africa. And it's a socio-ecological project, which is really exciting. And it's both those regions are cool because both of them don't have native floating plants. So all those floating plants you see, they do so well here in Europe and in Africa because we don't have plants that occupy that. We have duckweed, lemna, like teeny tiny plant, but that's it. So we have a real similarity there. And like I said, we're getting warmer temperatures and our water quality is not looking amazing. So we've got definitely some common ground and things we can learn from. And it means because we don't have native floating plants, when these plants do become dominant in these systems, they create completely novel habitats that we know nothing about. And I'm interested to find out what that means for mosquitoes, because mosquitoes and plants occupy the same systems. Mosquitoes spend most of their life history in the water as juveniles. They're only flying around in their final stage. And most of the time is in the water, and it's the same water that these plants are in. And if you remember those plants, how they looked with their root systems, what a great place to hide if you're a little mosquito larvae. And if you can hide in the roots of these floating plants and evade predation, maybe you can do really well in the water that fills in the rosette of a pistia. Maybe having more resting sites for adults increases oviposition, which increases egg laying in the systems. If you're a mosquito that breeds on the leaves of plants and before you were restricted to a few species around the edge of a pond, and now you've got the whole pond as covered in breeding sites for you, what does that mean? And the other things we know, like we know that these plants crash biodiversity in systems. So insects, fish, their species all wipe out. That could be really good if you're a mosquito because suddenly all your predators might have gone. So we're really interested in this link. Really surprised it's not really been looked at before. So yeah, we're working on that project now. Some of this I haven't put too much up because some of this now we're in the stage of writing up. But if there is anyone that wants to get involved with this project, it's really nice. We've got PhDs and master's students in South Africa, also in Europe, got field campaigns in both, and actually meeting with some people in the States this week to talk about, hear about what they're doing and talk about working together. And the idea is we want to investigate this the same way as before, so using experiments, using field, and using modeling as well, and learn from each other. And I think really try and connect scientists in these different parts of the world because these are shared problems. And interestingly, like with the plants, in terms of the same invasive species we're worried about and the lack of native floating species, from the mosquito side, we also have the same native species, and we're worried about some of the same invasive species as well. So there's some common ground there. Okay, well, the take-home messages are that, the management of invasive aquatics needs to be a holistic approach. And I think that's becoming more and more evident now. And they're often the symptom of a bigger problem, whether that's the eutrophication, how they're doing the system, or whether it's people not taking biosecurity particularly seriously. In Europe, it's really far behind. It's also, it's become less of a risk, I suppose. Here, people feel it's less risky because they've got less to lose, maybe, in terms of the water systems. But I don't think that's true. So people are sort of changing their minds now. And there's a need to understand the multi-trophic interactions with invasions as well. And I think all those things can really help more efficient management, especially in a warming world. And that's it. That's all I have to say for today. And thank you so much for listening. I don't know if anyone's still there, but if you are, thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, please ask.
Thank you, Emily. That was fantastic. Don't know if you can see us. Still lots of people here. So
Shall I stop sharing?
yeah, be great, because then you could see our
Then
faces.
I can see you. Where are you? Ah, there you all are. Hi.
No, I thought your talk was really engaging. I loved all the visuals, and I feel I've learned a lot about aquatic invasive species. I guess I could start with a question, unless anyone
Sure.
else has got a burning question. I think you touched on it at the end right there. Just wondering, why in Europe is there a more resistant attitude towards biocontrol? Is it just the lower risk, like you said, or are people more worried about unknown impacts from this?
Do you know, I think there's like three main things. And one, I think, I don't know, maybe controversial, maybe not, I don't know. But I really think it's true, having talked about this around the world in many different places. I think they don't like that this is an African innovation. Like, I think Europe's used to being the one that comes up with things, ideas, or solutions, and then hands them out to people. And I think they've liked that feeling. And I think when you say it, I don't know, I just get the feeling that if I said this could come from, I don't know, New Zealand, maybe they would have a different attitude. I really don't like it, and I fight for that a bit. But I feel like that's one. I feel like the other is maybe an awareness / education. I really feel like in South Africa, you can speak to kids and they will know quite a bit about invasive species and things like that. And here it's something you only learn later if you're doing something quite specialized in your studies. So maybe it's just sort of, it's not in the, I'm going to say popular culture, that sounds ridiculous, but you know what I mean? It's not in the day-to-day, because I think the risks of what you have to lose in terms of biodiversity. In the Netherlands, we've built on everything. There is no biodiversity left. That's, it's very, I shouldn't say that. There is some, but there's not much. And I think it does make people think the stakes aren't as high when you say things like, oh, this is a threat to biodiversity. I feel like it is different if you're living in a country with much higher biodiversity and flora. I saw some hands up. Maybe people totally disagree with me there. It's good to say these things.
Oh yeah, loads of hands up.
Yeah, I know. Sorry if I just offended lots of people. I didn't mean it. I just meant in general. That is sort of the vibe I get from students, And I get a lot of students as well when talking to them. There's a lot of fear over, but what about the impacts of what these biocontrol agents could do, which I think is fair. It's good to have those discussions. But again, it's like, yeah, but have you seen the impacts of what these plants do? Like, really displace whole communities because of access to food and water. Anyway, I'll stop talking because there's hands up.
No, sorry. I think you make a great point. I agree. In the European, or definitely in the British media, it's a lot more about cyanobacteria and that threat to water quality, which I guess is the same thing, but not to an extent. So yeah, it's interesting what you say. I'll let Craig go because his hand was up first.
Thanks. I hope you can hear. There's quite a loud storm here. Emily, I'm not sure if I missed your data. So I mean, I think your presentation is very interesting. And the question I want to know is, when you apply these biological controls on these floating invasives like water hyacinth or water cabbage or water lettuce or whatever, did you do any experiments on what would happen? And I know I saw something on the end, but like a comparison of native species if you remove the nutrient load back down to sort of ambient or natural levels. So do the native plants stand a chance under normal nutrient loads as opposed to these hypertrophic nutrient loads that we typically have across most of our rivers in the country? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. No, I didn't try. Yeah, I tried not to go too data-y because this was kind of an overview of many things. But indeed, it's a great question. And yeah, what we do see is the impact of the nutrient loading just gives these invasive plants such a competitive edge. And indeed, lowering the nutrient input really, it does make a difference for these native plants to give them a fighting chance. It also, yeah, I didn't include it, but we did do a whole study, and there's many other people working on this now and carrying on those sorts of ideas. This is already from a couple of years back. This was my PhD work, and looking not only at lowering the nutrients, but artificially upping the native species. So just giving them an artificial boost at the beginning. So you lower the nutrients, you boost the native population, and then you control the floating. And you see these communities, they bounce back way quicker, way quicker than if not. Yeah.
Great, thanks. That's very interesting.
Thanks. And then we'll go quickly. Daisy had a question on the chat, which I can read out, and then there's a few hands up. So I don't know if you can all see it. Daisy asks, are these biological agents safe for drinking water quality? For example, what about insect eggs or insect germs?
Yeah, absolutely. Super safe. All those aquatic systems are filled with plants and insects as they should be. That's what we want, nice native biodiversity. Just so happens these insects come from South America. So it's not been, they don't pose a threat to the quality of the water themselves, no.
Great. Should we go to Marilee? I think had her hand up. Their hand up next.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk, Emily. I enjoyed it very much. So I would just like, on the topic of Europe, maybe they don't have the same extent of a problem as Africa has, because we might have like different, the heat and the rain and everything might increase the plant populations extremely a lot. And then I just wanted to ask, have there any tests or studies been done on these biocontrol agents then becoming part of the food web for our local fauna? Are there some of our local fauna then that might become dependent on these biological agents, and might that then cause like a shift in the local community or the local population?
Yeah, really fantastic 2 points. The first one, absolutely right. The problem isn't as big here, but something that's really frustrating that we as humans always do is wait until something is a massive problem and then we go, probably should have done something about that. So I think what we try and do now is convince people like, look, let's not get to that stage, and let's control these plants before they fully take over. So yeah, fully agree. And for the second point, so that's really interesting. And there are more studies now. And I think the biggest, I don't know numbers off the top of my head, so I don't want to lie to you, but what I would say is the biggest thing to think about is timeframes. So when you have these biocontrol agents, and then they do really well because there's loads of food for them and their populations go really high, then they're able to eat all the plants and the plant crashes and they go down again. That can be in a matter of a couple of months. So it's not like that they're at these really high numbers before the plants crash for years and years. So long enough to become. So there was my pronunciation's horrible, Hartebeesport Dam. Oh, I'm just going to call it Hearties because that's easier for me to say.
Yeah, that's quite good.
Thanks. At the Hearties Dam there, they released the megamelus, which are an insect that if there's no food around, they will fly away. So they're mostly hanging around on leaves, and then if food quality crashes, they will fly. And their numbers got higher and higher and higher, and the plants all of a sudden crashed. So for the insects, there was suddenly like all this food had gone. So they all, and that's like, it's a huge, huge system. And, I think millions and millions of megamelus insects suddenly all were like, oh, there's no food. So they flew, and then they swarmed around like lampposts around tennis courts, the floodlights that had been on. And then they all died because they don't eat lampposts or anything else except the plant. And I think that was a really nice example of, yes, you get these booms in these insect populations, but insects don't live very long and they eat really, really well. So those big boom bust cycles are really on a very short time scale. So not what we think is long enough for native birds, reptiles, things that might eat those insects to become dependent. Maybe they have like a buffet, little snack for a couple of weeks and then they're not around so much. So yeah, but it's not something that's been looked at loads. And I think I'm not going to disagree with myself. I think multi-trophic interactions are really important. So I think it is something they should look into more for sure.
Thank you. That answers my question perfectly. Thanks.
No worries.
Cool. I think we've got time for one more question. I think Louisa Marie's very patiently had her hand up.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very comprehensive and very clearly structured. I have a very specific question. I visited Botswana this summer and I saw the Kariba weed covering almost every single water body that we saw. And I went to the Moremi National Game Reserve, and for me it was kind of remote. I didn't see any agriculture there, and yet these water bodies were all very much covered in Kariba weed. And I was just wondering, how likely is it that the original water quality is the reason for this invasion, and how likely is it that if it was removed with biological agents, that it would actually stay away?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, well, the biocontrol agents are great because they stay around. So it's all about control. It's not about a one-time removal. So generally, if they're there doing well, they will keep on top of the plant. And you'll always have the plant in that system because that's the nature of predator-prey interactions. But it'll be at a more like manageable or acceptable level. So I work on a couple of systems, dams in northern Tanzania, which, like you say, they're in like a protected area. There's no agriculture nearby. But these plants are there and doing really well. So then how can it be about the water quality? In those systems, there are hippos. Hippos poo a lot and fill water systems with nutrients. So it might not be, you know, from things like farming or human waste management or mismanagement, but they're still super high in nutrients because these hippos, they sit in these quite relatively small areas and they poo all day, and that's what they like to do. So there you see high nutrients in these plants, and in many systems, plants were introduced intentionally. Often people, the thinking was these plants like to suck up nutrients because you see them in nutrient systems. So if you have too many nutrients in the system, throw these plants in and they will remove the nutrients for you. So yeah, I think it's a bit multifaceted, the answer. It's yes, I do think biocontrol would keep on top of them. I think you have to look at the landscape you're working in. If it's a protected area, if it's a nature reserve, or if it's on the edge of a city, then obviously there are different pressures, and some might be more priority than the others. And I would say it's about pathways as well. The problem with aquatic systems that's so annoying is that they're all connected. So you know, it's difficult to look at things in isolation. Either they're actually connected through rivers and streams, or things like waterfowl, geese, whatever, will connect between systems all the time and move these plants around unintentionally. So yeah, good question.
Thank you very much. I didn't expect the hippos to be such a
Oh, sorry.
problem.
Yeah, I have a
Thank
talking problem. Yeah, no, it's a disease. There's no cure. Sorry for that.
you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emily. I think it's just gone two. Well, it's gone two here. So I think we'll leave it for the moment, but that's been fantastic. I think our next presentation is on Monday with Tamilia Nudu, and I'll send out details of that soon. But it's been fantastic to have so many people interested, and please keep checking the website for updates. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Sarah, for the invitation, and thanks to everyone for the nice questions. And yeah, please, my email address is there. I don't know, do I give you the slides?
We'll put them online.
Oh, there's a video. Okay,
yeah,
then please feel free to contact me, reach out if you want to chat anything more. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Ciao.